Arthur Schopenhauer was born on the first day of February in 1788 in the bustling port city of Danzig, today's Gdansk, where the Baltic wind carried the scent of salt and the distant echo of merchants' cries. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was a successful merchant, a man whose fortunes rose and fell with the tides of trade, while his mother, Johanna, was a woman of extraordinary intellect and unyielding will. From the moment young Arthur entered the world, his mother's influence was as pervasive as the sea that lapped at their doorstep. She had been educated in the finest salons of Hamburg, fluent in French, German, and Latin, and she nurtured in her son a voracious appetite for literature, philosophy, and the arts. One can almost hear the soft rustle of pages turning in their modest home as Johanna read aloud the works of Voltaire, the poetry of Goethe, and the ancient tragedies of Euripides. It was in those evenings, under the dim glow of oil lamps, that the seed of Schopenhauer's later pessimism was first planted, not through personal misfortune, but through an early, intimate acquaintance with the paradoxes of human desire and suffering. When Arthur was just a boy, his mother made a decision that would shape the trajectory of his intellectual life. She withdrew him from the commercial expectations of the family business and placed him under the tutelage of the best teachers she could find. At the age of 16, he entered the University of Göttingen, a hub of enlightenment thought where the air seemed charged with the promise of reason. Yet it was not long before he grew disillusioned with the prevailing rationalism that dominated his lectures. He found the empirical methods of the natural sciences insufficient to explain the deeper currents of human existence. In a letter to a close friend he wrote, "The world is not a machine, but a will, an endless striving that cannot be reduced to numbers or formulas." This sentiment, though not yet fully formed, hinted at the metaphysical turn that would later define his magnum opus. In 1809, Schopenhauer moved to the University of Berlin, where the intellectual climate was dominated by the towering figure of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's lectures on the phenomenology of spirit filled the great hall with an almost religious fervor. Students gathered in throngs, eager to witness the unfolding of the absolute. Schopenhauer, however, sat in the back rows, his brow furrowed, his mind wrestling with the contradictions he perceived. He admired Kant's critical philosophy, especially the distinction between phenomena and noumena, but he felt that Kant left the noumenal realm shrouded in mystery, a veil that could be pierced. Hegel, in contrast, claimed that the absolute could be known through dialectical development, a claim that Schopenhauer found both grandiose and, in his view, fundamentally flawed. The clash between Schopenhauer and the Hegelian establishment was not merely academic, it was personal. In 1813, after the fall of Napoleon and the reshaping of Europe at the Congress of Vienna, the German universities entered a period of intense ideological competition. Hegel's followers, emboldened by the political restoration, sought to cement his doctrine as the official philosophy of the state. Schopenhauerian lectures were dismissed as reactionary, his critiques dismissed as petty grievances. The university senate, swayed by the Hegelian majority, denied him the coveted position of private dozent, a private lecturer who could teach without a formal professorship. He was told in no uncertain terms that his ideas were incompatible with the spirit of the times. This rebuff, rather than silencing him, ignited a fierce determination. He resolved to publish his own synthesis, one that would combine Kant's critical insight with a metaphysical will that could account for the suffering he observed in the world. It was in this crucible of disappointment and resolve that The World as Will and Representation emerged in 1818. The title itself encapsulated a dual claim, that the world we experience, its forms, its colors, its laws, is merely a representation, a mental construction shaped by our senses, and that beneath this representation lies a blind, irrational force he called the will. In the preface he wrote, "The world is my representation is the world." This paradoxical statement, echoing Kant's transcendental idealism, also introduced a radical departure. The will, unlike Kant's unknowable noumenon, is not a static thing in itself, but an incessant, striving energy that manifests in all living beings. He illustrated this with the simple yet profound image of a hungry man reaching for a loaf of bread. The representation is the loaf, the desire to eat is the will, and the suffering that follows when the loaf is denied reveals the tragic nature of existence. To understand the depth of Schopenhauer's insight, one must consider the broader intellectual currents of post-Napoleonic Europe. The continent was still reeling from the devastation of wars, from the upheaval of monarchies, and from the promises of the French Revolution that seemed to have dissolved into bloodshed. German idealism, with its lofty aspirations to reconcile freedom, rationality, and the divine, offered a hopeful narrative. Yet beneath the surface, many felt a lingering sense of disillusionment, a feeling that reason alone could not heal the wounds of war and loss. It is within this atmosphere of both optimism and despair that Schopenhauer's pessimism found fertile ground. Moreover, Schopenhauer was not merely a product of Western thought. During his formative years, he encountered the translations of Eastern texts that were beginning to circulate in Europe, particularly the Upanishads and the Buddhist sutras. He was captivated by the concept of Brahman, the ultimate, unchanging reality beyond the world of appearances, and by the Buddhist doctrine of dukkha, the pervasive unsatisfactoriness of life. In a letter to his friend Eduard von Hartmann, he wrote, "The ancient sages of the East have glimpsed what I have called the will, an endless striving that never finds fulfillment." This cross-cultural dialogue enriched his philosophy, allowing him to argue that the suffering he identified was not a peculiarity of Western civilization, but a universal condition. The first vivid anecdote that illustrates Schopenhauer's combative spirit involves a duel that took place in 1829. The duel was not over a matter of honor in the traditional sense, but over the very right to speak philosophy. A fellow philosopher, Heinrich Gustav Böhm, a staunch Hegelian, publicly mocked Schopenhauer's work, calling it the melancholy of a failed academic. Schopenhauer, who had long harbored a deep resentment toward the Hegelian establishment, felt that his intellectual integrity could not be left unchallenged. He issued a formal challenge, and the two met in a secluded field outside Berlin, pistols in hand. The duel was swift. Böhm's shot missed, while Schopenhauer's bullet struck the opponent's shoulder, causing a painful wound but no fatal injury. The event sent shockwaves through the academic community. Newspapers reported, with a mix of scandal and amusement, that a philosopher had taken up the code of the duelist, a code that, in Schopenhauer's mind, was a necessary defense of truth against the tyranny of fashionable ideas. The duel, though violent, was less about bloodshed than about asserting the seriousness of philosophical dissent. The second anecdote, perhaps more enduring in its symbolic weight, concerns Schopenhauer's bitter rivalry with the followers of Hegel after the latter's death in 1831. In the years that followed, the Hegelian school consolidated its power, establishing a Hegelian circle that dominated university curricula. Schopenhauer, who had been denied a teaching position, took to publishing scathing reviews in the new Jobbucher für Philologie und Kritik. In one particularly biting article he wrote, "The Hegelian doctrine is a grand illusion, a castle built upon the sand of empty concepts." He went further, accusing Hegel's disciples of intellectual plagiarism, suggesting that they had taken Kant's critical insights and dressed them in the flamboyant robes of dialectic without genuine understanding. This public feud escalated to the point where Schopenhauer's works were systematically excluded from university libraries, and his name became a synonym for contrarianism. Yet paradoxically, this very marginalization contributed to the mythic aura that surrounded him, a lone voice crying out against the prevailing tide. Critics have often argued that Schopenhauer's pessimism was merely a product of personal misfortune, that his own life, riddled with loneliness, financial hardship, and unrequited love, colored his philosophical conclusions. It is true that he never married, that his relationships with women were fraught, most famously his infatuation with Caroline, the sister of his friend, which ended in bitter rejection, and that he lived much of his later years in relative poverty, subsisting on modest royalties from his writings. Yet to reduce his entire metaphysical system to a biographical footnote would be to miss the profound logical architecture he constructed. In the world as will and representation, he does not merely lament personal suffering. He offers a systematic account of why suffering is endemic to all sentient life. He draws on empirical observations of animal behavior, on the relentless drive of plants toward the sun, and on the perpetual striving of human desire. The will, for Schopenhauer, is an ontological principle that operates independently of any individual's personal woes. Even if his own experiences sharpened his sensitivity, the philosophical insight stands on its own, grounded in a rigorous analysis of the structures of consciousness and desire. Another line of criticism suggests that Schopenhauer's work was simply a derivative of Kant, that he merely repackaged the critical distinction between phenomena and noumena with a more dramatic flair. While it is undeniable that Kant's critique of pure reason provided the scaffolding for Schopenhauer's project, the divergence is stark. Kant posited that the noumenal realm is unknowable, a limit to human cognition. Schopenhauer, by contrast, claimed that the noumenal is not unknowable, but is directly experienced as the will, a blind, irrational force that manifests in every act of desire. He writes, "The thing in itself is the will, and the will is the thing in itself." This bold move transforms the abstract limit of Kantian epistemology into a concrete, albeit metaphysical, principle that can be examined through introspection and artistic expression. Moreover, Schopenhauer's emphasis on the primacy of the will over representation overturns Kant's hierarchy, placing desire at the core of metaphysics rather than relegating it to the realm of empirical psychology. In this sense, Schopenhauer is not a mere footnote to Kant, but a radical reinterpretation that opened new pathways for existential and phenomenological thought. To appreciate the depth of Schopenhauer's divergence, it helps to juxtapose his ideas with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Hegel posits that consciousness evolves through dialectical stages, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, ultimately reaching absolute knowledge where subject and object are reconciled. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, sees this dialectical march as an illusion, a narrative constructed by the will to mask its own insatiable cravings. He famously quipped, "All truth passes through three stages. First it is ridiculed, then it is violently opposed, then it is accepted as self-evident." While Hegel would argue that the final synthesis resolves the contradictions, Schopenhauer would claim that the resolution is merely another manifestation of the same underlying will, now cloaked in a different form. The will, for Schopenhauer, never ceases its striving, it merely changes its object. This fundamental disagreement on the nature of progress and resolution underscores why Schopenhauer's pessimism is not a fleeting mood, but a structural critique of the very notion of historical teleology championed by Hegel. The implications of Schopenhauer's philosophy extend far beyond academic debate. They have found resonance in literature, music, and even modern psychology. Consider the writer Thomas Mann, who in Dr. Faustus invokes Schopenhauer's notion of the will as a destructive creative force that drives both artistic brilliance and moral decay. Or the composer Richard Wagner, who, though initially a fervent admirer, later repudiated Schopenhauer's pessimism, yet could not escape its influence on his operatic tragedies. In the realm of psychology, the concept of the will anticipates the later development of the unconscious drive in Freud's psychoanalysis. Freud's id, the repository of primal urges, mirrors Schopenhauer's will as a blind, insatiable force that underlies conscious experience. Even contemporary cognitive science, with its investigations into reward pathways and the neurobiology of desire, echoes Schopenhauer's insight that human behavior is fundamentally driven by forces beyond rational deliberation. To bring these ideas into everyday life, imagine a modern example, a young professional, Anna, who works tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder. She attains a promotion, yet the satisfaction is fleeting. She soon feels a new yearning for a higher status, a larger salary, a more prestigious title. This endless cycle of achievement followed by renewed desire exemplifies Schopenhauer's claim that the will never finds lasting fulfillment. Another example can be found in the realm of technology, the constant release of new smartphones, each marketed as a solution to the previous model's shortcomings. Consumers line up, eager to possess the latest device, only to discover that the novelty soon fades and the desire for the next upgrade resurfaces. In both cases, the representation, the promotion, the new phone, serves as a temporary veil over the underlying will that propels us forward, never satisfied. Schopenhauer also offered a way out of this relentless suffering, albeit a narrow and demanding path. He turned to art as a temporary suspension of the will. When we engage with music, especially, he claimed, we experience a moment where the will is quieted, where the representation dissolves into pure form. He wrote, "Music is the direct expression of the will. It is the only art that can convey the innermost nature of reality." Yet paradoxically, by immersing oneself in music, one can achieve a fleeting liberation from the ceaseless striving. This insight influenced later existentialists and modernist artists who sought moments of transcendence amidst a world they perceived as fundamentally absurd. In the later years of his life, Schopenhauer's reputation underwent a remarkable transformation. While he died in 1860, largely ignored by the academic establishment, his ideas found a new audience among the burgeoning bohemian circles of Paris and Berlin. The poet Charles Baudelaire, the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, and the psychoanalyst Carl Jung all drew upon his notion of the will, each interpreting it through their own lenses. Jung, in particular, incorporated Schopenhauer's will into his concept of the collective unconscious, viewing it as an archetypal force that shapes human myths and symbols. This posthumous influence illustrates how a philosophy born out of personal disappointment and intellectual rivalry can, over time, become a cornerstone for diverse fields of thought. One might ask, does Schopenhauer's pessimism leave any room for hope? He himself suggested that the only true escape from suffering lies in the denial of the will, a radical asceticism reminiscent of Buddhist nirvana. He admired the Buddhist practice of renunciation, seeing it as a practical means to silence the will's incessant cravings. Yet he also recognized that such a path is attainable only for a few. In his own words, the salvation of the world lies in the salvation of the individual, and the salvation of the individual lies in the denial of the will. This statement, while austere, invites us to contemplate the possibility that ethical living, compassion, self-denial, artistic contemplation may serve as a modest antidote to the universal suffering he described. When we return to the intellectual climate of his time, we see that Schopenhauer's synthesis of Kantian critique, Hegelian dialectic, and Eastern metaphysics was a bold, almost rebellious act. He stood at the intersection of tradition and innovation, refusing to accept the prevailing optimism of German idealism, and instead offering a sobering counter-narrative that emphasized the darker currents of existence. His early experiences, his mother's intellectual rigor, his exposure to the harsh realities of post-Napoleonic Europe, his personal confrontations with academic power, shaped a philosopher who would not shy away from confronting the uncomfortable truths of human desire. The duel of 1829, the relentless feud with Hegelian scholars, the eventual marginalization of his work, and the later resurgence of his ideas, all these episodes form a tapestry that illustrates not only the man but the ideas he championed. They remind us that philosophy is not a sterile abstraction, but a lived experience, a dialogue between the thinker and the world that surrounds him. Schopenhauer's life, with its bouts of triumph and disappointment, mirrors the very will he described. A force that propels us forward, that compels us to seek meaning even when the horizon remains perpetually out of reach. In reflecting upon his legacy, we might consider how his insights resonate with contemporary concerns. In an age of unprecedented technological advancement, where desire is amplified by algorithmic recommendations and consumerist culture, the will appears more insistent than ever. Social media platforms designed to capture attention exploit the very mechanism Schopenhauer identified, the ceaseless striving for validation, for likes, for the next dopamine hit. The representation of self, curated photos, filtered narratives, becomes a veil that hides the underlying will while simultaneously feeding it. The modern individual, much like Anna in our earlier example, finds that each achievement, each new gadget, each viral post offers only a brief respite before the next yearning emerges. Schopenhauer's warning that the world is my representation feels eerily prescient, urging us to look beyond the surface of our digital lives and recognize the deeper currents that drive us. Yet even as we confront this modern incarnation of the will, we can also draw upon Schopenhauer's proposed antidotes. Art, music, and contemplative practices remain powerful tools for momentary liberation. Meditation, which shares roots with Buddhist traditions that Schopenhauer admired, offers a way to quiet the mental chatter, to observe the will without being enslaved by it. In this sense, his philosophy, while pessimistic in its diagnosis, is not wholly devoid of hope. It points toward practices that can mitigate suffering, even if only temporarily. To close this exploration, let us return to the words that encapsulate Schopenhauer's enduring insight: all life is suffering, and all suffering is caused by desire. This aphorism, drawn from the very heart of the world as will and representation, invites us to contemplate the paradox that the same force that animates us, our desire, our striving, is also the source of our most profound anguish. It is a truth that, while unsettling, offers a mirror in which we can examine the patterns of our own lives, the cycles of longing that repeat across centuries and cultures. In recognizing the will, in understanding its role, perhaps we can begin to navigate the world with a clearer, more compassionate eye, acknowledging the inevitability of desire, yet seeking the moments where the will is hushed, where representation gives way to a deeper, quieter awareness. Thus, the story of Arthur Schopenhauer is not merely a biography of a philosopher who lived in the shadows of his more celebrated contemporaries. It is a narrative of a mind that dared to challenge the prevailing optimism of his age, to draw from the wellsprings of Eastern thought, to confront personal and institutional adversity with a dual pistol in hand, and to articulate a metaphysical framework that continues to echo in the corridors of literature, psychology, and everyday experience. His life, his ideas, and his relentless pursuit of truth, however bleak, remain a testament to the power of philosophy to illuminate the hidden forces that shape our existence. In listening to his voice, we are invited to pause, to reflect, and perhaps, for a fleeting instant, to glimpse the world not as a relentless striving, but as a representation that we can observe, understand, and, in moments of grace, transcend. The world, as Schopenhauer insists, is first and foremost a representation, a mental picture that the mind constructs, a veil that hides what lies beneath. When we look at a tree, when we hear the distant hum of traffic, when we taste the bitterness of coffee, we are not encountering the thing in itself. We are encountering the phenomenon that our intellect arranges according to the principles of space, time, and causality. This is the doctrine of the world as Vorstellung, a term that translates roughly as representation or appearance. Schopenhauer borrowed the term from Kant, but he turned it on its head. For Kant, the thing in itself, the noumenal, remained forever unknowable, a silent background to the manifold of appearances. For Schopenhauerian thought, the noumenal is not a silent, abstract thing, but a living, blind force, the will, that underlies every representation, every phenomenon, every pulse of desire. To grasp this, imagine three lenses through which we might view reality. The first lens is the empirical, the world of everyday experience that science describes in terms of particles, forces, and equations. Through this lens, we see a star exploding, a river flowing, a heart beating, all of it quantified, measured, predicted. The second lens is the phenomenal, the world as it appears to us in the forms of space, time, and causality. Here the same star is a bright point in the night sky, the river is a winding ribbon of water, the heart is a thudding rhythm we feel in our chest. The third lens is the noumenal, the realm of the will, the blind, irrational striving that gives rise to both the empirical and the phenomenal. It is not a substance in the Cartesian sense, nor a deity with purpose. It is an aimless, incessant push, a force that manifests itself in every living organism, in every act of desire, in every moment of suffering. Consider first a simple, heartbreaking scene. A child, gaunt and trembling, clutching an empty bowl, eyes wide with hunger. In the child's body, a cascade of physiological signals, low blood sugar, empty stomach, hormonal changes, converge into a single, overwhelming urge. To eat, Schopenhauer would say that this urge is not merely a physiological response, but an expression of the will in its most primal form. The will, blind and irrational, compels the child to seek nourishment, to survive, to perpetuate the species. The child's hunger is not a rational calculation. It is a raw, unmediated manifestation of the will's incessant striving. The representation, the child's perception of emptiness, the sight of a piece of bread, the taste of water is only the surface, the veil that the intellect throws over the deeper, more fundamental force that drives the child forward. Now turn to a very different experience. The moment a symphony swells, the violins rise, the brass thunder, and the listener feels a sudden, inexplicable sense of unity, a dissolution of the self into the music. In that instant, the listener's ordinary representations, the notes, the timbre, the rhythm, fall away, and what remains is a fleeting glimpse of the will's unity. Schopenhauer believed that art, especially music, is the highest form of cognition because it bypasses the representational veil and directly expresses the will. Music, unlike a painting or a sculpture, does not depict objects. It is an abstract, pure expression of the underlying force. When the symphony reaches its climax, the listener experiences a momentary release from the ceaseless striving of the will, a brief respite from suffering, a glimpse of what Schopenhauer called the will-less state of contemplation. In that state, the individual is no longer a separate ego caught in the endless cycle of desire. Instead, they become a conduit through which the will reveals its own unity. Schopenhauer's path to these ideas was not a solitary ascent, but a journey through the texts of many traditions. In the early 1840s, while still a young professor at the University of Berlin, he stumbled upon an English translation of the Upanishads, the ancient Indian scriptures that speak of Brahman, the ultimate, indivisible reality underlying all phenomena. The Upanishadic notion of a single, all-pervading reality resonated deeply with Schopenhauer's own intuition that behind the manifold of appearances there must be a single, unifying principle. He wrote in his notebook, "The Upanishads have taught me that the world is not a collection of things, but a single, boundless will." This encounter helped him to articulate the will not as a mere metaphor, but as a metaphysical reality, a force that, like the Upanishadic Brahman, is both immanent and transcendent, yet entirely beyond rational conception. Equally illuminating was his correspondence with the poet Heinrich Heine, a man whose lyrical sensibility often clashed with Schopenhauer's stark pessimism. In a letter dated March 1851, Heine wrote, "Your will is a dark river, my dear Arthur, but I see in its depths the reflection of my own melancholy." Schopenhauer replied, "And yet, Heinrich, it is precisely this darkness that gives our art its power. The will that drives us to create is the same will that drives us to suffer." Their exchange reveals how Schopenhauer's metaphysics was not an abstract exercise, but a lived, artistic experience. Heine's poetry, with its emphasis on longing and loss, became, for Schopenhauer, a concrete illustration of the will's expression in human culture. Their dialogue also underscores a paradox. The will is both the source of suffering and the wellspring of art, the very medium through which we may momentarily escape its tyranny. yet Schopenhauer's doctrine has never been without its critics. The first major objection is that the will, as a metaphysical entity, is unfalsifiable. It cannot be tested, measured, or observed in any empirical way. Critics argue that invoking a blind, irrational force to explain desire and suffering is tantamount to reintroducing a god of the gaps, a placeholder for what science has yet to explain. They point out that modern psychology can account for hunger, for artistic appreciation, through neural mechanisms, reward pathways, and cultural conditioning, without invoking a metaphysical will. If the will cannot be observed, how can it claim any explanatory power beyond poetic metaphor? A second, more contemporary criticism comes from neuroscience. Modern brain imaging shows that the experience of desire, of aesthetic appreciation, is rooted in specific neural circuits, the ventral striatum lighting up in response to reward, the default mode network deactivating during deep concentration, the auditory cortex resonating with harmonic structures. Some philosophers argue that Schopenhauer's dualism, the split between representation and will, collapses under this data. If the brain itself generates both the representation and the feeling of will, then there is no need to posit a separate, noumenal force. The will, they claim, is simply the brain's own self-organizing dynamics, a product of evolutionary pressures, not a metaphysical substrate. In response to these criticisms, one can turn to the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was both a disciple and a fierce critic of Schopenhauer. Nietzsche admired Schopenhauer's insight that life is driven by a fundamental force, but he rejected the notion of a blind, purposeless will. Instead, he proposed the will to power, a dynamic, creative force that seeks not merely to survive, but to dominate, to overcome, to become. Nietzsche's reinterpretation reframes the same metaphysical insight in a more affirmative light, suggesting that the underlying drive is not merely a source of suffering, but also a source of growth and self-overcoming. When we compare Nietzsche's will to power with Schopenhauer's will, we see a dialogue. Schopenhauer sees the will as a source of endless frustration, while Nietzsche sees it as a potential for transformation. This cross-reference helps us to appreciate the richness of the original doctrine and its capacity to evolve. Even more recently, philosophers of mind such as Daniel Dennett have offered tools to reinterpret Schopenhauer's ideas within a contemporary framework. Dennett's intentional stance, the practice of treating an entity as if it has beliefs and desires in order to predict its behavior, resonates with Schopenhauer's claim that the will is the ultimate intentional force behind all phenomena. While Dennett insists that intentional language is a pragmatic tool, not a claim about metaphysical reality, he also acknowledges that our cognitive architecture is shaped by deep, evolutionary drives. In this sense, the will can be reimagined not as an unknowable metaphysical thing, but as a heuristic for understanding the deep evolutionary programming that underlies human behavior. By juxtaposing Dennett's intentional stance with Schopenhauer's will, we can see a bridge between 19th century metaphysics and 21st century philosophy of mind. If you wish to dive deeper into Schopenhauer's original text, begin with the first 4 sections of The World as Will and Representation. In Section 1, Schopenhauer lays out the Kantian framework, reminding us that all our knowledge is mediated by the forms of sensibility. Pay close attention to his phrase, "The world is my representation," and note how he immediately qualifies this with a reference to the thing in itself. In Section 2, he introduces the will as the thing in itself, using the metaphor of a blind, striving organism. Here, highlight his famous line, "Will is the inner nature of the world, the metaphysical principle of all that is." In Section 3, he discusses the distinction between the will as object and the will as subject, a subtle but crucial point that reveals why he does not equate the will with a deity. Finally, in Section 4, he turns to aesthetics, arguing that art provides a temporary escape from the will's tyranny. When you read these passages, keep a comparative chart in mind. On one side lists the Kantian categories space, time, causality, and on the other side lists Schopenhauer's corresponding concepts, representation, will, artistic insight. This visual aid will help you see how Schopenhauer both inherits and transforms Kant's critical philosophy. The philosophical implications of Schopenhauer's metaphysics ripple outward into ethics, politics, and even environmental thought. If the will is the source of all striving, then compassion, the recognition that the suffering of another is, in fact, a manifestation of the same will, becomes an ethical imperative. Schopenhauer famously wrote, "Compassion is the basis of morality, because it acknowledges the shared underlying force that binds all beings." In political terms, the relentless striving of the will can be seen as a driver of conflict, of imperial ambition, of the endless chase for resources. Recognizing this can lead to a more pacifist stance, a call for restraint in the face of the will's insatiable appetite. In environmental philosophy, the will's blind push for survival explains humanity's exploitation of nature. It is not merely a rational calculation, but an instinctual drive that overrides reflective judgment. Understanding this can inform strategies for sustainability that aim to temper the will with conscious, compassionate regulation. To bring these abstract ideas back into everyday life, consider two concrete examples beyond the child's hunger and the symphonic experience. First, think of the compulsive habit of scrolling endlessly through a social media feed. The mind, in its representation of the world, presents a stream of images, notifications, likes, each a promise of fleeting satisfaction. Yet the underlying drive is not a rational desire for information, but the will's endless craving for stimulation. The scroll becomes a modern manifestation of the same blind force that once drove a starving child to seek food. Recognizing this pattern can help us step back, to observe the representation without being enslaved by it, perhaps by taking a mindful pause, thereby catching a glimpse of the will's rhythm and choosing not to be swept away. Second, imagine a scientist in the laboratory, painstakingly assembling a complex experiment. The representation here is the apparatus, the data, the hypothesis. Yet the will's presence is felt in the scientist's relentless curiosity, the inner push that refuses to settle for the status quo. When the experiment finally yields a breakthrough, the scientist experiences a moment of aesthetic joy, akin to the symphonic climax, where the representation dissolves and the unity of the will, the drive toward knowledge, shines through. In this way, scientific discovery becomes a form of art, a manifestation of the will's creative impulse. Returning to the historical anecdotes, it is worth noting that Schopenhauer's fascination with the Upanishads was not a casual reading. He obtained a copy of the 1832 English translation by Max Müller, a scholar who was then introducing Eastern thought to the West. Schopenhauer spent nights poring over verses that speak of the world as Maya, the illusion that veils the true reality. He wrote in his journal, "Maya is the veil of representation, the underlying Brahman is the will." This synthesis of Eastern and Western thought was revolutionary, predating the later wave of comparative philosophy that would flourish in the 20th century. It also gave him a vocabulary to describe the will as something that cannot be grasped directly, but only inferred through its manifestations, much as the Upanishadic sages described Brahman as that which cannot be spoken. Equally vivid is the story of his correspondence with Heine, which began after Schopenhauer published his first major work in 1818. Heine, then a rising literary star, responded with a mixture of admiration and skepticism, asking, "Do you truly believe that all of existence is a single, blind will?" Schopenhauer's reply, laced with his characteristic irony, declared, "If the will is blind, it is nevertheless the only eye we possess." Heine later referenced Schopenhauer's idea in his poem Die Loreley, where he writes, "In the depths of the river's current, a will unseen pushes all to its end." This poetic echo shows how Schopenhauer's metaphysics seeped into the cultural imagination of his time, influencing not only philosophers but also poets, musicians, and painters. When we examine modern neuroscience, we find that the brain's reward system dopamine pathways that light up in response to food, sex, novelty, can be seen as a physiological correlate of the will's striving. Yet, as we noted, the will is not reducible to dopamine. The will, for Schopenhauer, is a metaphysical principle that persists even when the neurochemical explanations are stripped away. The hunger of the child is not just a spike in ghrelin, it is the will's demand for life. The appreciation of a symphony is not merely the activation of the auditory cortex, it is the will's momentary suspension of its own striving. This tension between reductionist explanations and metaphysical insight invites a dialogue rather than a dismissal. To navigate this dialogue, consider constructing a comparative chart that places Schopenhauer's threefold view alongside contemporary frameworks. In the left column, list empirical science, phenomenal Kantian representation, noumenal will. In the right column, align these with modern neuroscience, empirical data, cognitive phenomenology, subjective experience, and evolutionary drives underlying adaptive pressures. Such a chart reveals both overlaps and gaps. For instance, while modern neuroscience can map the empirical layer, it often struggles to explain the qualitative, lived experience, the phenomenological aspect, which Schopenhauer captures through representation. The will, then, can be reinterpreted as the evolutionary drive that undergirds both the empirical and the phenomenological, a bridge that connects the hard data with the soft experience. Another useful analytical tool is the intentional stance proposed by Dennett. When we treat the child's hunger as a goal-directed behavior, we adopt an intentional stance. When we treat the symphonist's composition as an expression of artistic intention, we again adopt the same stance. Schopenhauer's will can be seen as the ultimate intentional stance, the deepest level at which any behavior can be understood as goal-directed, even if the goal is simply to persist. By comparing Dennett's pragmatic stance with Schopenhauer's metaphysical will, we can ask, is the will a literal metaphysical entity, or is it a useful abstraction that captures the deepest level of intentionality in living systems? This question sits at the heart of the debate between metaphysics and philosophy of mind. If you wish to explore the primary texts, begin by reading the opening paragraph of The World as Will and Representation, where Schopenhauer writes, "The world is my representation." This is the truth of the doctrine, and it is also the whole of the doctrine. Notice how he immediately ties the epistemic claim to the ontological one. Then move to section 2, where he declares, "The will is the inner nature of the world, the metaphysical principle of all that is." Highlight the word inner, which signals that the will is not external to representation but its hidden core. In section 3, pay attention to his distinction between will as object, the thing in itself, and will as subject, the perceiving self that experiences desire. Finally, in section 4, read his discussion of art, especially his claim that music alone is the direct objectification of the will. As you annotate these passages, keep a margin note that references Kant's critique of pure reason, especially the sections on the categories of understanding, to see how Schopenhauer both inherits and overturns Kantian limits. Beyond the text, consider how Schopenhauer's ideas have been taken up in literature and film. In Thomas Mann's novel Death in Venice, the protagonist's obsessive longing for beauty is portrayed as a manifestation of the will, leading to his downfall. In the film Blade Runner, the replicant's yearning for life can be read as a modern, technological expression of the same blind striving that drives the starving child. These cultural artifacts illustrate how the will continues to provide a lens for interpreting human desire, creativity, and tragedy. Finally, reflect on the practical implications for your own life. When you feel a sudden pang of hunger, a craving for novelty, or a deep emotional response to music, pause and ask yourself, what is the representation here and what is the will behind it? By distinguishing the two, you may find a moment of clarity, a chance to observe the force without being swept away. In moments of artistic immersion, try to let the representation fade, allowing the unity of the will to surface. This practice, akin to Schopenhauer's pure contemplation, can bring a fleeting sense of peace, a brief release from the endless cycle of desire. It is not a cure for suffering, but a reminder that the will, though blind, can be glimpsed, understood, and for a moment transcended. In sum, the metaphysics of the will offers a powerful framework for interpreting the world as both representation and underlying force. It bridges Kantian epistemology with Eastern mysticism, connects the suffering of a starving child with the ecstatic unity of a symphonic climax, and invites dialogue with modern thinkers from Nietzsche to Dennett. By engaging with Schopenhauer's primary texts, by constructing comparative charts, and by applying his insights to everyday experiences, you can deepen your understanding of the profound, blind force that drives all of existence. The journey through representation to the will is not merely an academic exercise. It is an invitation to see the world anew, to recognize the hidden currents beneath the surface, and perhaps, for a brief, shining instant, to glimpse the unity that lies at the heart of all things. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet stillness of a hospital room at dusk, the soft whir of machines, the hushed breath of a patient whose life has been measured not in years, but in moments of lingering pain. A doctor stands at the bedside, faced with a choice that seems to echo through the corridors of philosophy itself. To intervene, to prolong the fragile flicker of existence, or to step back, allowing the inevitable tide of suffering to recede. In Schopenhauer's vision, this decision is not merely a clinical judgment. It is an expression of the deepest ethical impulse, mitleid compassion, the spontaneous recognition that the other's suffering is, in its very core, our own. When the physician feels that pang of empathy, when the will to alleviate pain is eclipsed by the will to cease the perpetuation of suffering, he is enacting what Schopenhauer calls the denial of the will. The will, that blind, insatiable force that drives all beings, is momentarily suspended by the compassionate act, and in that suspension, a glimpse of ethical salvation appears. Schopenhauer's ethics arise from a metaphysical foundation that differs starkly from the rationalist traditions of Kant or the utilitarian calculus of Bentham. He begins with the premise that the world is fundamentally will, an irrational, striving essence that manifests in every living creature. This will is not a conscious intention, but a blind, relentless drive toward existence and desire. Because the will is the source of all striving, it is also the source of all suffering. Desire begets lack, lack begets pain, and the cycle repeats ad infinitum. In this bleak landscape, morality cannot be grounded in reason alone, for reason merely maps the contours of representation, the world as we perceive it. Instead, Schopenhauer locates the moral law in the moment when the individual recognizes that the other is not a separate object, but an embodiment of the same underlying will. He writes, in the world as will and representation, compassion is the basis of morality, the only genuine motive for moral action. It is this recognition, this intuitive, effective insight, that dissolves the egoic barrier and allows the will to be denied, even if only temporarily. The doctor's choice, then, becomes a concrete illustration of this metaphysical insight. When he refuses to prolong a terminal patient's life, he is not merely following a policy of non-maleficence. He is responding to the suffering of the other as his own. The compassionate impulse overrides the blind push of the will to preserve life at all costs, revealing a higher ethical order that is not dictated by duty in the Kantian sense, nor by the calculation of greatest happiness, but by a direct, felt identification with the other's pain. In this moment, the will is quieted, and the individual acts not from self-interest but from the shared will that underlies all existence. Schopenhauer does not stop at compassion. He extends his ethical vision into the realm of asceticism, where the denial of the will becomes a disciplined practice. The ascetic, in renouncing desire, seeks to extinguish the very engine of suffering. He draws upon Eastern traditions, particularly Buddhism, whose emphasis on the cessation of craving mirrors his own call for the negation of the will. The Buddhist notion of KRU letter 1E47 macron, compassion that arises from the insight into the emptiness of self, finds a resonant echo in Schopenhauer's Mitleid. Both traditions suggest that true moral conduct springs from a deep, almost mystical, identification with the suffering of all beings. As Schopenhauer remarks in the Parerga and Paralipomena, the man who has learned to feel compassion for all living beings is the man who has become aware of the one universal will that animates them. This line bridges the Western and Eastern ethical landscapes, offering a fertile ground for cross-cultural dialogue. Yet not everyone accepts compassion as a metaphysical revelation. One prominent counterargument asserts that what Schopenhauer calls compassion is nothing more than an evolved self-preserving instinct. Evolutionary psychologists argue that empathy evolved because it promoted group cohesion and, ultimately, individual survival. From this perspective, the doctor's decision could be read as a calculation, perhaps subconscious, about the quality of life, the allocation of scarce medical resources, or the avoidance of emotional burnout. If compassion is merely a biological adaptation, then it lacks the transcendent, universal quality that Schopenhauer attributes to it. The moral weight of the act would then rest on pragmatic concerns rather than on a metaphysical insight into the will. Schopenhauer anticipates this objection by distinguishing between mere sympathy, a fleeting feeling, and genuine compassion, which he describes as a feeling of the suffering of the other as our own, accompanied by the desire to alleviate it. He insists that true compassion is not contingent upon personal gain. It persists even when the alleviation of suffering brings no benefit to the self. Moreover, he points to the phenomenon of self-sacrificial acts, where individuals willingly endure pain or even death for strangers, as evidence that compassion can transcend self-interest. The doctor who refuses to keep a patient alive merely for the sake of prolonging existence, despite the potential prestige or financial reward, exemplifies this higher form of moral feeling. In this light, compassion is not reducible to a self-preserving instinct, but reveals a deeper ethical structure embedded in the very fabric of will. A second counterargument challenges the role of aesthetic contemplation as a path to liberation. Schopenhauer famously declares that art offers a temporary respite from the tyranny of the will. When we are absorbed in a work of art, a symphony, a painting, a poem, we become pure, will-free subjects of knowledge, suspended in a state where the incessant striving of desire falls silent. Critics, however, argue that this escape is merely illusory, a fleeting distraction that leaves the underlying suffering untouched. They claim that the aesthetic experience, while soothing, does not alter the fundamental condition of the will. It merely masks it with a veneer of beauty. If the liberation offered by art is only temporary, can it truly be considered a form of salvation? Schopenhauer's response is nuanced. He acknowledges that aesthetic contemplation does not eradicate the will, but he emphasizes its transformative power. In the moments of deep artistic engagement, the individual experiences a world as representation, devoid of personal desire. This state, he argues, cultivates a taste for the negation of the will, training the soul to recognize the futility of endless striving. The experience of viewing a Van Gogh painting, for instance, can serve as a vivid illustration. Imagine standing before starry night, the swirling heavens and luminous moons drawing you into a realm where time seems to pause. In that instant, the usual chatter of the will, appointments, obligations, cravings, fades. You are no longer a subject driven by hunger or ambition. You become a pure perceiver, a conduit for the painting's essence. This suspension, though brief, offers a glimpse of what Schopenhauer calls the aesthetic salvation, a momentary release that can, over time, cultivate a deeper detachment from the will. The Van Gogh example also ties into Schopenhauer's broader claim that the highest forms of art, music above all, directly express the will itself, while visual arts and literature provide a representation that can be abstracted from personal desire. Music, in his view, is the most direct articulation of the will's essence, resonating with the listener's innermost vibrations. Yet even a painting can lift us beyond the everyday. When we are moved by the tragic beauty of a portrait or the sublime vastness of a landscape, we feel a kinship not only with the artist's vision, but with the universal will that animates all phenomena. This kinship, in turn, nurtures compassion, because recognizing the shared substratum of existence expands our empathic horizon. To understand how Schopenhauer arrived at these ideas, we must trace his intellectual lineage. He was profoundly influenced by Immanuel Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, but he rejected Kant's optimistic faith in pure reason. Instead, Schopenhauer adopted the Kantian thing in itself as the will, an irrational force that cannot be captured by conceptual thought. He also drew heavily from Eastern philosophies, especially the Upanishads and Buddhist teachings, which he encountered through translations of the Mahayana texts. In his preface to The World as Will and Representation, he writes, "All Eastern philosophers, especially the Hindus, have already discovered that the world is representation and that the thing in itself is will." This synthesis of Western critical philosophy and Eastern contemplative practice gave rise to his unique ethical vision. Schopenhauer's personal life offers a vivid backdrop to his philosophical development, particularly his relationship with the composer Richard Wagner. In the early 1850s, Schopenhauer and Wagner forged a friendship rooted in a shared admiration for the power of art to transcend ordinary experience. Wagner's operas, with their mythic narratives and intense emotional currents, seem to embody Schopenhauer's notion that music could directly express the will. Schopenhauer praised Wagner's Tristan und Isolde as the most perfect expression of the inner world of the will, yet their friendship soon soured. Schopenhauer, ever the polemicist, published a scathing review of Wagner's The Ring Cycle, accusing the composer of pandering to bourgeois tastes and diluting the profound metaphysical potential of music. He wrote, "Wagner has turned the music of the will into a vulgar spectacle, a mere entertainment for the masses." The scandal that followed, public debates, personal letters laced with bitterness, revealed the intensity with which Schopenhauer guarded his aesthetic ideals. This episode illustrates how his ethical and aesthetic theories were not abstract musings but lived convictions, capable of igniting fierce personal conflict. The scandal also underscores another dimension of Schopenhauer's thought: the tension between the individual's moral autonomy and the pressures of cultural institutions. Wagner, a rising star in the German musical establishment, represented the collective will of a society eager for grand, accessible art. Schopenhauer's critique, rooted in a philosophical commitment to the purity of artistic expression, positioned him as a solitary voice against the tide of popular opinion. This dynamic mirrors the doctor's ethical dilemma. The individual must decide whether to align with societal expectations, prolonging life at any cost, producing art for mass consumption, or to follow a deeper, perhaps solitary, insight into suffering and the will. In modern times, Schopenhauer's ethics find resonance in contemporary debates about end-of-life care. Bioethicists grapple with the principle of do no harm versus the duty to preserve life. The doctor's refusal to extend a terminal patient's existence can be framed through the lens of palliative care, where the goal is to alleviate suffering rather than to sustain biological function at all costs. Empirical studies show that patients who receive compassionate, patient-centered care often report higher quality of life, even in the final weeks. This aligns with Schopenhauer's claim that the moral act lies in recognizing the other's suffering as one's own and acting to relieve it, even if that means allowing death. Integrating primary texts, such as the Perurga essay on the basis of morality, can enrich a classroom discussion, prompting students to compare Schopenhauer's compassion with the modern principle of beneficence in medical ethics. The aesthetic dimension also speaks to current understandings of art therapy and the psychological benefits of immersion in visual or musical experiences. Studies on flow states, moments when individuals become fully absorbed in an activity, show that these experiences reduce stress hormones and increase feelings of well-being. When a viewer stands before Van Gogh's Starry Night and feels the world's turbulence dissolve into swirling light, they are, in a sense, entering the very pure, will-free state Schopenhauer described. While neuroscientists might explain this in terms of dopamine release, the phenomenological quality of the experience, its capacity to quiet the incessant chatter of desire, mirrors the aesthetic salvation Schopenhauer envisioned. By juxtaposing empirical findings with Schopenhauer's philosophical account, educators can illustrate how his ideas anticipate contemporary interdisciplinary research. Cross-referencing further deepens the conversation. Consider the Buddhist concept of upaya, skillful means, which teaches that compassionate action must be tailored to the context of suffering. The doctor's decision to forego life-prolonging measures is a form of skillful means, recognizing that extending existence may amplify pain rather than alleviate it. Similarly, Kant's deontological ethics emphasizes duty derived from rational law, yet Kant acknowledges that moral duty must be grounded in respect for persons as ends in themselves. Schopenhauer's compassion, however, goes beyond respect. It demands an effective identification that blurs the boundary between self and other. Finally, Sartre's existentialist notion of radical freedom, man is condemned to be free, offers a stark contrast. Sartre argues that we are always responsible for our choices, but he locates freedom in the act of self-creation, not in the denial of a metaphysical will. By placing Schopenhauer's denial of the will alongside Sartre's affirmation of freedom, we can explore a tension. Is true liberation found in the cessation of desire, as Schopenhauer claims, or in the embrace of freedom, as Sartre insists? This dialectic invites listeners to reflect on whether ethical authenticity lies in surrendering the will or in exercising it consciously. Analogies can illuminate these abstract ideas. Picture the will as a river that rushes ceaselessly toward the sea, carving valleys, eroding banks, never pausing. Compassion, in Schopenhauer's view, is a dam built not to halt the river entirely, but to divert a portion of its flow, allowing the water to pool into a calm lake where reflections are clear. In that lake, the tumult of the current is momentarily still, and the observer can see the sky without distortion. The doctor, by refusing to add more water to the river of life, creates a stillness that lets the patient's suffering dissolve into peace. Similarly, when we gaze upon a Van Gogh canvas, the brushstrokes act as stones placed across the river, creating eddies where the will's rush is softened and the mind can rest. These images help us grasp how compassion and art function as interventions that modulate, rather than annihilate, the will's flow. Historical anecdotes further enrich the narrative. In 1860, Schopenhauer attended a performance of Wagner's Lohengrin at the Königliches Opernhaus in Berlin. He sat alone in the audience, his eyes fixed on the stage, and later wrote in his diary, "I felt a profound shudder of the will, as if the music had stripped away the veil of representation and revealed the raw pulse of existence." Yet, after the performance, he penned a scathing critique in Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, accusing Wagner of commercializing the music of the will. This public denunciation sparked a heated exchange with Wagner's supporters, who accused Schopenhauer of jealousy and of lacking appreciation for popular taste. The episode illustrates how Schopenhauer's ethical and aesthetic standards could clash with prevailing cultural currents, a clash that continues today when avant-garde art challenges mass entertainment. Another anecdote involves the philosopher's encounter with a Buddhist monk during a visit to a Viennese monastery in 1855. The monk, versed in the Mahayana doctrine of compassion, engaged Schopenhauer in a dialogue about the nature of suffering. The monk remarked, "When one sees the suffering of another, the heart expands and the self-interest shrinks." Schopenhauer, impressed, wrote in his notes, "The Buddhist insight confirms the universality of compassion. It is not a Western invention, but a truth that transcends cultures." This meeting reinforced his conviction that compassion is a metaphysical insight, not a mere instinct, and it underscores the cross-cultural relevance of his ethics. To bring these ideas into a classroom or a public lecture, one might interweave primary texts with contemporary case studies. Begin by assigning the Pururga essay on the basis of morality, where Schopenhauer explicitly defines compassion as the sole moral motive. Follow this with a reading of the Brahma Sutras on compassion in Buddhism, and then present a modern medical ethics case study, perhaps the 2017 Terry Schiavo decision, where physicians and families grapple with the limits of life-sustaining treatment. Students can compare the arguments, noting where Schopenhauer's emphasis on shared will aligns or diverges from legal and ethical frameworks. In a parallel session, show images of Van Gogh's Starry Night and ask participants to describe their subjective experience, then juxtapose these reflections with excerpts from Schopenhauer's On the Theory of the Sublime and his commentary on music as the direct language of the will. This multimodal approach allows learners to feel the aesthetic suspension while engaging with the philosophical argument. When discussing the counterargument that compassion is self-preserving, one can introduce evolutionary psychology research on empathy, such as the work of Franz de Waal on primate consolation behavior. Presenting empirical data alongside Schopenhauer's claim that true compassion persists even when it brings no benefit encourages critical analysis. Does the existence of altruistic behavior in animals undermine the metaphysical claim? Or does it merely illustrate a natural foundation upon which Schopenhauer builds a higher philosophical edifice? Encouraging students to wrestle with this tension sharpens their ability to evaluate philosophical arguments in light of scientific findings. Similarly, to address the critique of aesthetic contemplation, introduce contemporary studies on the default mode network in the brain, which deactivates during deep artistic immersion, suggesting a neurological basis for the quieting of self-referential thought. Pair this with Schopenhauer's assertion that the aesthetic experience is a temporary escape from the will. Students can debate whether a temporary neurological quieting qualifies as genuine liberation, or whether liberation demands a more permanent transformation of character, as Schopenhauer's ascetic ideal proposes. In weaving these strands together, the narrative of Schopenhauer's ethics becomes a tapestry that connects the 19th century philosopher with modern medicine, neuroscience, and cross-cultural spirituality. The doctor's moral decision, the viewer's encounter with Van Gogh, the turbulent friendship with Wagner, and the compassionate dialogue with a Buddhist monk all serve as living illustrations of the central claim. That by recognizing the other's suffering as our own, and by momentarily suspending the will through compassion or art, we glimpse a path beyond the relentless striving that defines existence. To conclude, let us reflect on a final quotation from Schopenhauer's Pererga: "All the misery of the world is caused by the unending striving of the will. The only remedy is the denial of the will, achieved through compassion and the aesthetic contemplation of the beautiful." This sentence encapsulates the dual pillars of his ethical project: compassion as the moral engine and art as the aesthetic sanctuary. By integrating these ideas with contemporary case studies, by juxtaposing them with Buddhist compassion, Kantian duty, and Sartrean freedom, we invite our listeners not merely to understand Schopenhauer's philosophy intellectually, but to experience its implications in the quiet moments of their own lives. Whether a physician stands at a bedside, a viewer pauses before a painting, or a student grapples with a text, the invitation remains the same: to recognize the shared will that binds us, to feel the other's pain as our own, and in doing so to catch a fleeting glimpse of salvation beyond the ceaseless churn of desire. It is tempting, when we look back across the winding corridors of intellectual history, to imagine that great ideas simply appear, fully formed, in the mind of a solitary genius, and then cascade outward like a river breaking a dam. Yet the story of Arthur Schopenhauer's reception, from the dim corridors of 19th century German salons to the bustling lecture halls of contemporary philosophy departments, is far more intricate. It is a tale of rediscovery, of fierce admiration, of bitter rupture, and of the restless reinterpretation that keeps a philosopher's voice alive long after the ink on his pages has dried. In this segment we will trace that journey, pausing to listen to the echo of Nietzsche's early awe and later repudiation, to hear Freud's tentative claim that Schopenhauer had already glimpsed the unconscious, and to follow the threads that bind Schopenhauer to Wittgenstein's picture theory, to Camus's absurd, and to the modern pessimism of Thomas Ligotti. Along the way we will meet the scholars who revived Schopenhauer in the 1860s, the editors who painstakingly assembled the Kritische Gesamtausgabe, the critics of the Vienna Circle who dared to re-engage with metaphysics, and the cultural artifacts, novels, paintings, films, that have kept his ideas humming in the background of Western thought. Imagine the year 1860. The German Empire is still a constellation of principalities, the revolutions of 1848 have fizzled, and the dominant philosophical current is Hegelian idealism, still humming like a grand organ in the lecture halls of Berlin and Heidelberg. In this atmosphere, a young scholar named Eduard von Hartmann, who would later publish Philosophy of the Unconscious, discovers a slim, unassuming volume on a dusty shelf in the library of the University of Leipzig. Schopenhauer's Die Welt als Will und Vorstellung, The book, first published in 1818, had been largely ignored by the academic establishment, relegated to the margins of the Philosophische Bibliothek and dismissed as the melancholy musings of a pessimistic recluse. Yet Hartmann, driven by a restless curiosity, opens the work and is struck by the immediacy of its claim, that the world is fundamentally will, an irrational, blind force that underlies all phenomena. He writes in a private journal, "Here lies a philosophy that does not merely explain the world but feels it, its pulse, its ache, its relentless striving." This personal revelation would soon become a catalyst for a broader scholarly revival. The revival took shape in the monumental Kritische Gesamtausgabe, the critical complete edition of Schopenhauer's works, begun in 1859 under the direction of the publisher Friedrich Wilhelm Heine. The project was ambitious: to gather every published text, every fragment, every marginal note, and to present them with scholarly apparatus, footnotes, variant readings, and a biographical commentary. The first volume, released in 1865, included the Perurga Unparallelpomena, a collection of essays that had originally been intended as a supplement to the world as will and representation. The Kritische Gesamtausgabe was not merely a scholarly endeavor, it was a cultural event. It signaled that Schopenhauer's thought was worthy of the same rigorous editorial care afforded to Kant, Hegel, and Goethe. The edition attracted the attention of the young Friedrich Nietzsche, then a student of philology at the University of Bonn, who would soon become one of the most vocal, and later most conflicted, admirers of Schopenhauer. Nietzsche's early admiration is most vividly recorded in his 1873 essay, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, where he writes, "Schopenhauer's doctrine of the will is the most powerful and the most tragic of all metaphysical systems. In the untimely meditations, specifically in the first meditation, Schopenhauer as educator, Nietzsche elevates Schopenhauer to the role of a philosophical teacher who forces the modern individual to confront the darkness at the heart of existence. He praises the German philosopher's willingness to look into the abyss and to articulate the suffering that underlies the veneer of civilization. Nietzsche's own early work, The Birth of Tragedy, bears the imprint of Schopenhauer's aesthetics. The notion that art, particularly music, can provide a temporary respite from the tyranny of the will, that the Dionysian can redeem the Apollonian. Nietzsche's admiration is not a faint echo. It reverberates through his own stylistic choices, aphorisms, paradoxes, and a lyrical intensity that mirrors Schopenhauer's own literary flair. Yet admiration, as history often reminds us, can turn into repudiation when the disciple discovers a divergence that feels existential. By the late 1870s, Nietzsche's relationship with Schopenhauer had soured. In Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, he declares, "I have ceased to be a disciple of Schopenhauer. I have become a critic." The break is most starkly articulated in the Untimely Meditations' second essay, On the Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life. Here Nietzsche attacks the Schopenhauerian resignation, arguing that the will to live must be transformed into a will to power. He claims that Schopenhauer's metaphysical negation of desire, his call for ascetic denial, is a form of life-denying nihilism that cannot sustain the flourishing of humanity. Nietzsche's will to power is presented not merely as a continuation of the will, but as its affirmative reinterpretation, a dynamic, creative force that seeks self-overcoming rather than surrender. The debate over whether Nietzsche's will to power is a direct continuation of Schopenhauer's will or a decisive rupture has occupied scholars for over a century. One camp, following the reading of scholars such as Paul Vane and Peter Dewes, argues that Nietzsche's concept is a logical outgrowth. They point to the structural similarity. Both notions locate the origin of phenomena in a pre-rational force. Both deny that rational cognition can fully capture reality, and both see art as a privileged mode of access. They cite Nietzsche's own acknowledgement in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that the will is the essence of all that is, suggesting a continuity. The opposing camp, championed by thinkers like Alexander Nehamas and Rudiger Safransky, emphasizes Nietzsche's moral and existential turn. They note that Schopenhauer's solution is negation, an ethical call to compassion and the denial of the will, whereas Nietzsche's solution is affirmation, a call to create values, to embrace struggle, to become overman. In this view, the will to power is not a mere relabeling but a radical reorientation that rejects the Schopenhauerian ethic of resignation. While Nietzsche was wrestling with Schopenhauer's legacy, another figure across the intellectual map was quietly reconfiguring the terrain of the mind, Sigmund Freud. In his 1900 work The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud writes, "The unconscious is the repository of the will, of the instinctual forces that drive us, much as Schopenhauer described the will as the thing in itself behind the world of representation. Freud's claim is both an homage and a strategic move. By aligning his nascent psychoanalytic theory with a respected philosophical tradition, he bolstered the intellectual legitimacy of his project. Freud's citation of Schopenhauer is not a casual footnote. It appears in the very preface, where he acknowledges that the philosophical insights of Schopenhauer anticipated the discovery of the unconscious. This acknowledgement sparked a cascade of scholarly debate. One line of critique, advanced by the early 20th century philosopher Karl Jaspers, argues that Freud misreads Schopenhauer's metaphysics, treating the will as a psychological drive rather than a metaphysical principle that underlies all of reality. Jaspers points out that Schopenhauer's will is not merely a personal, psychic phenomenon, but an ontological ground that manifests in nature, in physics, in the movement of stones as well as in human desire. To reduce it to the unconscious is to miss the breadth of Schopenhauer's claim that the will is the thing in itself that Kant could not know. In contrast, scholars like Peter Gay have defended Freud, suggesting that the unconscious can be read as a phenomenological correlate of Schopenhauer's will. Both refer to forces that escape direct introspection, both shape experience from behind the scenes, and both demand a method, psychoanalysis or art, to make them intelligible. The conversation between Freud and Schopenhauer did not remain confined to academic journals. It seeped into cultural artifacts of the early 20th century. In the 1911 expressionist painting, The Scream by Edvard Munch, the anguished figure can be read as a visual embodiment of the will's endless striving and the resulting existential dread, a theme that both Schopenhauer and Freud would have recognized. Later, in the 1920 film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the twisted, nightmarish set design mirrors the Schopenhauerian view that the world is a representation shaped by an irrational will, while the plots focus on hidden motives and subconscious control echoes Freud's insights. These artistic examples illustrate how Schopenhauer's philosophical motifs migrated beyond the page, influencing the visual language of modernity. The revival of Schopenhauer in the early 20th century took an unexpected turn through the critics of the Vienna Circle. The Circle, with its logical positivist credo, declared metaphysics dead, insisting that only empirically verifiable statements could count as meaningful. Yet within that circle, a group of thinkers, Moritz Schlick's student, Philipp Frank, and the mathematician and philosopher Rudolf Carnap, found themselves repeatedly confronting the limits of verificationist criteria when dealing with questions of value, meaning, and suffering. In a series of informal seminars held in the cafes of Vienna, they would discuss Schopenhauer's notion that the world is my representation as a philosophical antecedent to the later phenomenological emphasis on lived experience. While the Circle's official publications rarely mentioned Schopenhauer, the private correspondences reveal a nuanced engagement. Carnap wrote to his brother, "I cannot dismiss Schopenhauer outright. His insistence on the primacy of the will forces us to confront the non-empirical dimensions of human life, even if we must reframe them in logical terms." This anecdote underscores that even the most rigorous empiricists could not entirely silence Schopenhauer's voice. The influence of Schopenhauer continued to ripple through the mid-century. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his early Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, develops the picture theory of language, positing that the world is the totality of facts, not of things. While Wittgenstein does not cite Schopenhauer directly in the Tractatus, scholars such as Ray Monk and Georg Henrik von Wright have highlighted a structural resonance. Both philosophers view representation as a mapping between reality and a symbolic structure, and both acknowledge the limits of language in capturing the totality of existence. Wittgenstein's later work, especially the Philosophical Investigations, returns to the theme of the unsayable, a space that Schopenhauer famously reserved for the will itself. The will is the thing in itself, which we cannot know directly, only through its manifestations. This convergence suggests that Schopenhauer's metaphysical insistence on the ineffable helped shape the linguistic turn in analytic philosophy, even if the influence was indirect. Across the Atlantic, the French existentialist and absurdist Albert Camus engaged Schopenhauer's pessimism in a more literary fashion. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This affirmation of meaning in the face of absurdity can be read as a response to Schopenhauer's claim that life is a constant striving, an endless cycle of desire and suffering. Camus acknowledges the bleakness, yet refuses to surrender to resignation. He says, "I would rather live my life as a rebel than as a passive victim of the will." The tension between Camus's rebellion and Schopenhauer's compassion mirrors the Nietzschean split we observed earlier. The question is whether to deny the will to transform it or to live alongside it with conscious defiance. In the latter half of the 20th century, a new wave of pessimistic thought emerged, often grouped under the label philosophical pessimism, with Thomas Ligotti standing out as a contemporary voice. Ligotti, a horror writer and essayist, draws explicitly on Schopenhauer in his collection The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. He writes, "Schopenhauer taught us that the world is fundamentally a will, blind, insatiable, indifferent. The only honest response is to recognize the horror of existence and to seek a quiet, aesthetic withdrawal." Ligotti's articulation of cosmic pessimism parallels Schopenhauer's ethical prescription of compassion, yet he pushes it further into a cultural critique of modernity, technology, and the illusion of progress. His work demonstrates how Schopenhauer's ideas have been reappropriated in contemporary cultural criticism, bridging literature, philosophy, and even the horror genre. To compare primary texts, secondary scholarship, and cultural artifacts in a comprehensive discussion, one must adopt a methodological triangulation. First, engage directly with Schopenhauer's original writings, The World as Will and Representation, The Perurga, his essays on ethics and aesthetics. Pay close attention to key passages. The opening declaration that the world is my representation, the discussion of the principle of sufficient reason, and the compassionate ethic that the suffering of one is the suffering of all. Second, read the primary texts of the thinkers we are discussing, Nietzsche's untimely meditations and Beyond Good and Evil, Freud's interpretation of dreams, Wittgenstein's Tractatus and Philosophical Investigations, Camus's Myth of Sisyphus, and Ligotti's essays. Note the exact language they use when invoking Schopenhauer, whether they quote him verbatim or paraphrase his concepts. Third, incorporate secondary scholarship that offers contextual analysis. Rudiger Safranski's biography of Nietzsche, Peter Gay's history of Freud, Paul Ricoeur's phenomenological reading of Schopenhauer, and contemporary articles in the Journal of the History of Philosophy that examine the Vienna Circle's engagement with metaphysics. Fourth, bring in cultural artifacts, visual art, literature, cinema, that embody Schopenhauerian motifs. Analyze how the representation of the will appears in expressionist painting, in the narrative structure of film noir, or in the thematic preoccupations of horror fiction. By juxtaposing these layers, textual, scholarly, artistic, you can map the diffusion of Schopenhauer's ideas across disciplines and epochs. Consider a concrete example, the 1935 novel The Trial by Franz Kafka. Although Kafka never mentions Schopenhauer, the novel's depiction of an inscrutable, indifferent bureaucracy can be read as an embodiment of the will's blind, irrational force. Scholars such as Stanley Korngold have argued that Kafka's law functions as a metaphysical will that subjects cannot comprehend, echoing Schopenhauer's claim that the will is the inner nature of the world, and we can never know it directly. By tracing this literary parallel, we see how Schopenhauer's metaphysics infiltrated modernist literature, even when the author was not explicitly aware of it. Another illustrative case is the 1970s punk movement, with its raw, confrontational aesthetic and its lyrical focus on alienation and nihilism. Bands like the Sex Pistols declared, "We are the children of the nightmare," a sentiment that resonates with Schopenhauer's view that life is a constant oscillation between desire and pain. While punk musicians rarely cited Schopenhauer, cultural historians such as John Savage have noted that the philosophical undercurrents of existential dread and rejection of bourgeois values in punk lyrics find a philosophical ancestor in Schopenhauer's critique of the will to live as a source of suffering. This example demonstrates how Schopenhauer's ideas can be traced not only through scholarly citations, but also through the emotional currents of popular culture. When we examine the counterarguments to the dominant narratives, we encounter the first, the view that Nietzsche's will to power is a direct continuation rather than a rupture. Proponents of this view often cite Nietzsche's own acknowledgement in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the will to power is the will to live, but more. They argue that Nietzsche never intended to abandon Schopenhauer's metaphysical foundation, but to expand it, adding a creative, self-affirming dimension. They point to the structural similarity of the aphoristic style, the shared emphasis on the tragic nature of existence, and the common reliance on art as a redemptive force. Moreover, they note that Nietzsche's criticism of Schopenhauer's asceticism is not a denial of the will, but a critique of a particular ethical response to it. In this reading, Nietzsche's will to power can be seen as a higher-order articulation of the same underlying principle. The opposing counterargument insists that Nietzsche misinterpreted Schopenhauer, turning a metaphysical principle into a psychological one. Critics like Gilles Deleuze argue that Nietzsche's will to power replaces Schopenhauer's monistic will with a pluralistic field of forces, thereby fundamentally altering the ontological landscape. Deleuze notes that Schopenhauer's will is a singular, blind striving, whereas Nietzsche's will to power is a multiplicity of drives, each seeking to assert itself. This shift, Deleuze contends, moves Nietzsche away from Schopenhauer's pessimistic resignation toward an affirmative, life-enhancing ethic. The debate thus hinges on whether we interpret will as a static metaphysical substrate or as a dynamic, relational process. The second counterargument concerns Freud's alleged misreading of Schopenhauer. Critics claim that Freud, in his eagerness to locate a philosophical precedent for the unconscious, reduced Schopenhauer's expansive metaphysics to a proto-psychoanalytic theory of desire. They argue that Schopenhauer's will is not a personal, psychic drive, but an ontological principle that manifests in both natural phenomena and human psychology. By equating the will with the unconscious, Freud, they say, imposes a psychological framework onto a philosophical system that was never intended to be clinical. Yet defenders of Freud, such as the historian of ideas Ernst Gombrich, counter that Freud's appropriation was strategic. He needed a philosophical lineage to legitimize his revolutionary claims, and Schopenhauer offered a respectable bridge. Gombrich suggests that the misreading is less an error than a purposeful reinterpretation, a common practice in the history of ideas where concepts are reshaped to fit new paradigms. To navigate these disputes, scholars employ a comparative textual analysis. One method is to line up parallel passages. Schopenhauer's assertion in World as Will that the will is the thing in itself, the inner nature of the world, alongside Nietzsche's declaration in Beyond Good and Evil that the will to power is the fundamental reality. By examining the surrounding context, Schopenhauer's ethical argument for compassion, Nietzsche's critique of morality, one can assess whether the similarity is superficial or substantive. Similarly, juxtaposing Freud's discussion of the unconscious in dreams with Schopenhauer's discussion of the will's manifestation in representation allows us to see whether Freud's borrowing is a direct translation or a conceptual transformation. When we consider the modern revival of Schopenhauer in contemporary philosophy of pessimism, we see a renewed interest in his ethical prescriptions. Thomas Ligotti, in his essay, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, cites Schopenhauer's claim that compassion is the basis of morality and expands it into a radical critique of anthropocentrism. Contemporary philosophers such as David Beneder, author of Better Never to Have Been, echo Schopenhauer's conclusion that non-existence is preferable to existence in their arguments for antinatalism. Beneder's asymmetry argument, where the presence of pain is bad, but the absence of pleasure is not equally bad, finds a philosophical ancestor in Schopenhauer's assessment of suffering as the dominant feature of life. These connections illustrate that Schopenhauer's influence is not confined to historical footnotes, but actively shapes present-day ethical debates. The cross-references do not stop there. In the realm of analytic philosophy, the later work of Thomas Nagel, particularly his essay The Absurd, engages with Schopenhauer's notion of the strangeness of existence. Nagel writes, "The absurdity of life is not a moral judgment, but a recognition of the tension between the seriousness with which we take our lives and the possibility of taking them lightly. This tension mirrors Schopenhauer's dual stance. He acknowledges the tragic nature of existence while also proposing an aesthetic escape through art and a compassionate ethic that mitigates suffering. By drawing on Schopenhauer, Nagel situates his own existential inquiry within a longer philosophical tradition. In the field of aesthetics, the influence of Schopenhauer can be traced through the music of Richard Wagner, whose operas were explicitly inspired by the philosopher's ideas. Wagner's Tristan und Isolde embodies the concept of the will as endless longing, a musical manifestation of Schopenhauer's doctrine that desire is the source of suffering. The leitmotif that recurs throughout the opera can be heard as an auditory representation of the will's relentless drive. This artistic collaboration serves as a vivid illustration of how Schopenhauer's metaphysics found concrete expression in the performing arts, influencing not only philosophical discourse, but also the evolution of Western music. The story of Schopenhauer's reception also includes a more recent digital turn. In the early 2000s, online philosophy forums such as the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Phil Papers saw a resurgence of interest in Schopenhauer's pessimism, with scholars posting translations of his lesser-known essays and engaging in spirited debates about his relevance to contemporary existential crises, climate change, technological alienation, and the rise of artificial intelligence. One notable thread on a philosophy subreddit in 2015 featured a discussion titled Schopenhauer and the Singularity: Will the Will Survive? Participants compared Schopenhauer's view that the will is a blind force with contemporary concerns about autonomous AI, asking whether the will might be instantiated in machines. This digital dialogue demonstrates that Schopenhauer's ideas continue to serve as a conceptual springboard for modern philosophical speculation. To synthesize these strands, we can outline a comparative framework for a comprehensive 5,000-word discussion. Begin with a chronological narrative. The 1860s rediscovery via the kritische Gesamtausgabe, the early Nietzschean admiration and later rupture, Freud's appropriation, the Vienna Circle's reluctant engagement, and the 20th century cultural diffusion. Interweave primary quotations: Schopenhauer's "The world is my representation," Nietzsche's "We have to become what we are," Freud's "The unconscious is the repository of the will," with secondary analyses that contextualize each moment. Follow each major figure with a counterargument section, presenting both the supportive and critical readings, and use analogies, such as comparing the will to a river that both nourishes and erodes, to clarify complex concepts. Insert historical anecdotes, like the anecdote of Hartmann's discovery of the dusty volume and the story of the Vienna Café seminars, to humanize the intellectual process. Then broaden the scope with cross-references to Wittgenstein's picture theory, Camus's absurd, Ligotti's horror, and contemporary antinatalism, showing the network of ideas that radiate from Schopenhauer's core. Finally, conclude with a methodological guide: how to align textual evidence, scholarly interpretation, and cultural representation, encouraging the listener to trace the pathways of influence themselves. As we listen to the echo of Schopenhauer's voice across the centuries, we might ask ourselves, what does it mean for a philosophy to be both a mirror and a window? Is it a mirror that reflects our own suffering back to us, as Schopenhauer suggests, or a window that offers a view of a deeper, perhaps more unsettling, reality? The answer may lie not in a single definitive stance, but in the very dialogue we have traced: the admiration, the rupture, the misreading, the reinterpretation. Each generation picks up the philosopher's pen, adds its own ink, and in doing so, keeps the conversation alive. In that sense, Schopenhauer's legacy is not a static monument, but a living, breathing discourse, one that continues to challenge us to confront the will, to question the unconscious, and to find, perhaps, a quiet dignity amid the endless striving of existence. When we turn our attention to the world today, the echo of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy can be heard in the restless hum of our cities, in the flicker of screens that never truly dim, and in the quiet sighs of those who stare at a horizon that seems to be warming faster than any promise of relief. It is tempting to think of Schopenhauer as a 19th century curmudgeon, a man who sat in his dim study and declared that life is nothing but will to life, a blind, insatiable force that drags us inevitably towards suffering. Yet if we listen closely, his observations about desire, illusion, and the fleeting respite offered by art and contemplation have become, in many ways, a lens through which we try to make sense of climate anxiety, digital addiction, and the search for meaning in a world that has largely shed its religious certainties. Consider first the pervasive sense of dread that many feel when they read the latest climate report. The graphs of rising temperatures, the images of coral bleaching, the stories of communities displaced by floods, each of these data points is not merely a statistic. It is a reminder that the will that drives human expansion has outstripped the capacity of the planet to sustain it. Schopenhauer wrote, "The world is my idea, my will is the thing in itself." In his view, the will is a metaphysical engine that propels all living beings forward, never satisfied, always craving more. When we translate that insight into the language of eco-philosophy, we see a striking parallel. The relentless drive for growth, for consumption, for technological mastery is the same will that now threatens the very ground beneath our feet. This is where the first modern example comes into play: the rise of mindfulness practices that, on the surface, seem to belong to a very different tradition: Buddhist meditation, secular psychology, even corporate wellness programs. Yet beneath the gentle breathing exercises and the soothing guided visualizations, there is a subtle echo of Schopenhauer's call for the denial of the will. He argued that the only way to achieve a momentary escape from suffering is to quiet the incessant cravings that characterize the will. In his Parerga and Paralipomena, he wrote, "By denying the will, we become free from the tyranny of desire." Modern mindfulness teaches us to observe thoughts without attachment, to notice cravings for likes, for validation, for the next dopamine hit, and to let them pass. In doing so, practitioners experience a kind of inner stillness that Schopenhauer would have recognized as a glimpse of the world as representation. the world seen not as a battlefield of wants, but as a canvas of phenomena that can be observed without being driven. A second contemporary illustration is the critique of consumer culture through Schopenhauer's lens of endless desire. The philosopher famously declared, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." In other words, we are free to act, but the underlying motives, our deepest wants, are not of our choosing. In the age of algorithmic advertising, of infinite scroll designs that keep us chasing the next notification, this insight feels eerily prescient. The modern consumer is caught in a loop where desire is manufactured, amplified, and then briefly sated, only for the next product, the next upgrade, the next trend to appear on the horizon. Schopenhauer would argue that this perpetual state of want is the very engine of suffering. Contemporary thinkers such as Byung-Chul Han have built on this idea, describing the burnout society as a culture of self-exploitation, where the will is turned inward and the subject becomes both the exploiter and the exploited. When we read Schopenhauer's critique alongside Han's, we see a continuity. The will's endless striving, now dressed in the digital garb of personal branding and hustle culture, still leads to the same hollow outcome, an unending sense of lack. These philosophical threads have not remained confined to the ivory towers of academia. They have filtered down into popular culture in ways that both illuminate and distort Schopenhauer's thought. Take, for instance, Alain de Botton's The Consolations of Philosophy, a bestseller that reimagines the great philosophers as practical therapists for modern life. In the chapter on Schopenhauer, de Botton writes, "If you can learn to see the world as a stage for the will, you can step back from the drama and find a quiet corner to breathe." He frames the philosopher's pessimism not as a call to despair, but as a pragmatic tool for coping with the anxieties of contemporary existence. The book's success has sparked a wave of philosophy for the masses, podcasts, Instagram quote graphics, and YouTube essays that present Schopenhauer as a kind of existential life coach. Even more striking is the viral TikTok series that began in early 2024, where a young creator, known only by the handle @SufferingSage, paired short clips of everyday frustration, traffic jams, endless Zoom calls, the anxiety of checking the news, with captions quoting Schopenhauer. "All suffering is the result of desire. The cessation of desire is the cessation of suffering." The series amassed millions of views, spawning a chorus of comments from users who found in Schopenhauer a language for their own digital fatigue. Some critics dismissed the videos as misreading the philosopher, but the very fact that his words resonated with a generation raised on smartphones suggests that his analysis of desire and suffering still strikes a chord. Yet, as with any philosophical import, there are robust counterarguments that challenge the relevance or applicability of Schopenhauer's pessimism to progressive activism and modern inclusivity. The first objection contends that his bleak outlook is fundamentally at odds with the energy required for social change. If life is essentially suffering, why bother fighting for a better world? Critics argue that such a worldview could engender fatalism, discouraging the very activism needed to address climate change, systemic inequality, or the harms of digital overuse. In response, some contemporary scholars point out that Schopenhauerian pessimism does not prescribe resignation. Rather, it invites a reorientation of our motivations. By recognizing the futility of endless striving, we might redirect our energies toward compassionate action that alleviates suffering, not for the sake of achieving a utopian ideal, but because the alleviation itself is an expression of the very empathy that Schopenhauer acknowledges as a higher form of will. In this reading, activism becomes a compassionate response to the universal condition of suffering, rather than a naive belief in perfectibility. A second critique targets Schopenhauer's aesthetic solution, the idea that art, especially music, offers a temporary escape from the tyranny of the will. Detractors claim this is elitist, privileging those with access to high culture, while ignoring the lived realities of those who cannot afford concert tickets or museum passes. Moreover, they argue that an aesthetic retreat does not address structural injustices, it merely offers a personal, fleeting reprieve. To engage this objection, we can broaden the notion of art to include the everyday creative practices that proliferate in digital spaces. The short video, the meme, the indie game, the street mural. Each of these can function as a momentary suspension of the will, a space where the viewer is absorbed in form rather than desire. When a teenager spends an hour crafting a digital illustration, or a community gathers to paint a mural on a neglected wall, the act can be both an aesthetic experience and a collective affirmation of shared humanity. In this sense, Schopenhauer's aesthetic insight can be democratized, becoming a tool for communal resilience rather than an exclusive retreat for the cultured elite. Cross-referencing Schopenhauer with modern philosophical movements further enriches our understanding of his place in today's intellectual landscape. Eco-philosophy, for instance, grapples with the tension between human desire and planetary limits. Thinkers like Timothy Morton, who coined the term hyper-object, describe climate change as an entity that is so vast it exceeds human comprehension, yet it is intimately tied to the willful expansion of human activity. Schopenhauer's notion that the will is blind and insatiable dovetails with Morton's observation that our collective desire creates objects that outgrow us, forcing a re-evaluation of our relationship to the natural world. Similarly, transhumanist discourse, which envisions a future where technology can transcend biological limitations, often celebrates the will's capacity for self-overcoming. Yet Schopenhauer would caution that any such transcendence that merely amplifies desire could exacerbate suffering rather than diminish it. If we augment our capacities without addressing the underlying structure of want, we risk creating a new tier of desire, one that is more efficient, more pervasive, and perhaps even more relentless. Scientific perspectives on suffering, especially from evolutionary psychology, provide an empirical complement to Schopenhauer's metaphysical claims. Researchers have identified that the brain's pain circuitry evolved not only to signal physical injury, but also to signal social and existential threats, loss of status, rejection, uncertainty about the future. This aligns with Schopenhauer's idea that suffering is rooted in the perpetual striving of the will. Our nervous system is wired to react to any perceived shortfall between desire and reality. Studies on dopamine reveal that the reward system is designed for intermittent reinforcement, a mechanism that keeps us chasing the next hit, much like the will's endless appetite. By integrating these findings, we can argue that Schopenhauer's philosophical diagnosis of desire as the source of suffering finds resonance in the biology of the human mind. Let us now turn to concrete, lived examples that illustrate how Schopenhauer's thought can be applied in everyday life. Imagine a coastal community in the Pacific Northwest, where rising sea levels threaten homes and livelihoods. Residents organize a quiet hour each evening, during which they turn off all electronic devices, dim the lights, and sit together on the beach, listening to the rhythm of the waves. In this practice, they are not denying the reality of climate change, nor are they surrendering to hopelessness. Rather, they are creating a shared space where the will's incessant chatter, news alerts, social media updates, the anxiety about the future, temporarily recedes, allowing a collective experience of presence. As Schopenhauer suggested, such moments of aesthetic or contemplative immersion can reduce the intensity of suffering, providing the emotional bandwidth needed to engage in sustained activism. A second illustration comes from the world of digital minimalism. A tech-savvy writer in Berlin decides to adopt a one-screen rule. Only one device may be on at any given time, and social media apps are removed entirely. The writer reports that after a few weeks, the compulsive urge to check notifications diminishes and a sense of calm emerges. This personal experiment mirrors Schopenhauer's counsel to deny the will in order to achieve a more authentic mode of being. By intentionally limiting the channels through which desire is constantly fed, the writer experiences a reduction in the mental noise that fuels anxiety. The writer's testimony, shared in a popular blog post, has inspired a community of readers to experiment with similar constraints, demonstrating how a philosophical insight can seed practical lifestyle changes. These anecdotes also highlight the role of storytelling in making abstract philosophy accessible. The TikTok series mentioned earlier, for example, uses short, relatable vignettes to illustrate Schopenhauer's point that the more we strive, the more we suffer. By pairing these captions with everyday scenes, a commuter stuck in traffic, a teenager scrolling endlessly, the creator transforms a dense metaphysical claim into a visual metaphor that resonates with millions. Similarly, de Botton's book reframes Schopenhauer's pessimism as a therapeutic tool, inviting readers to see their own anxieties reflected in a philosophical tradition. In both cases, the medium becomes the message, and the ancient idea finds new life. Now, let us address the skeptical voice that asks, if Schopenhauer says life is fundamentally suffering, why not simply accept nihilism and stop trying? The answer lies in the subtlety of his ethical prescription. While he acknowledges the primacy of suffering, he also identifies compassion, what he calls Mitleid, as the highest moral impulse. In the world as will and representation, he writes, compassion is the basis of morality, for it is the feeling that the suffering of another is also our own suffering. This insight predates modern empathy research, which shows that shared emotional experiences foster prosocial behavior. In the context of climate anxiety, compassion can translate into collective action, caring for the planet because we feel the planet's distress as our own. In the realm of digital addiction, compassion can lead us to design technologies that respect human well-being rather than exploit it. Thus, Schopenhauer's pessimism is not a call to surrender, but a call to recognize the depth of suffering and respond with an ethic that seeks to alleviate it wherever possible. The question of elitism and aesthetic escape can be reframed by examining how contemporary culture democratizes artistic experiences. The rise of open-source music platforms, community theater, and virtual reality art installations means that the art Schopenhauer praised is no longer confined to concert halls. A teenager in Lagos can download a symphonic piece for free, a farmer in rural India can attend a local dance performance, and a retiree in Tokyo can explore a VR museum from his living room. Each of these encounters offers a moment where the will's demands are suspended, even if briefly. Moreover, the creation of such art often emerges from marginalized voices, turning the aesthetic experience into a site of empowerment rather than exclusion. In weaving together these threads, climate anxiety, digital addiction, secular meaning, mindfulness, consumer critique, popularization, counterarguments, and interdisciplinary cross-references, we begin to see a tapestry where Schopenhauer's ideas are not relics but active participants in contemporary discourse. The philosopher's insistence that desire is the root of suffering finds empirical support in neuroscience. His advocacy for aesthetic contemplation finds new expression in digital media. His ethical emphasis on compassion resonates with modern movements for social and ecological justice. Even his pessimism, once dismissed as fatalistic, can be reinterpreted as a sober assessment that fuels a more realistic, compassionate activism. To expand this segment into a full-featured video that reaches the desired depth, we can outline a roadmap that incorporates multiple layers of engagement. First, conduct interviews with scholars from different fields. An evolutionary psychologist who can explain the neurobiology of desire, an eco-philosopher who can articulate the parallels between Schopenhauer's will and climate dynamics, and a digital ethicist who can discuss how mindfulness practices intersect with Schopenhauer's denial of the will. Their perspectives will provide authoritative voices that ground the philosophical claims in contemporary research. Second, gather quantitative data that illustrate the prevalence of digital addiction and climate anxiety. For instance, recent surveys from the Pew Research Center show that 62% of adults report feeling very worried about climate change, while a study published in Computers and Human Behavior finds that the average adult spends over 9 hours per day on screen-based devices. By juxtaposing these statistics with Schopenhauer's claim that the will is the source of all suffering, we create a compelling empirical narrative that underscores the relevance of his analysis. Third, incorporate reflective exercises for the viewer. After discussing mindfulness as a modern echo of Schopenhauer's denial of the will, invite the audience to pause for a guided breathing exercise, encouraging them to notice the arising of desire and to let it pass without judgment. Following the segment on consumer culture, suggest a desire audit, a short worksheet where viewers list recent purchases, identify the underlying wants, and reflect on whether those wants truly contributed to lasting satisfaction. These interactive elements transform passive listening into active contemplation, mirroring Schopenhauer's own emphasis on personal insight. Fourth, embed historical anecdotes that enrich the narrative. One such story recounts how Schopenhauer, after publishing his magnum opus, was largely ignored by his contemporaries, only to be rediscovered by Nietzsche, who called him the only philosopher who has ever truly understood the tragedy of existence. Another anecdote describes the 1930s German literary circle around Thomas Mann, where Schopenhauer's ideas on art as salvation inspired Mann's novel The Magic Mountain, a work that explores the tension between intellectual contemplation and the pull of the will. By weaving these episodes into the script, we illustrate how Schopenhauer's influence has rippled through cultural history, shaping literature, psychology, and even cinema. Fifth, draw connections to modern philosophical movements. Eco-philosophy's concept of deep ecology posits that all life has intrinsic value, a stance that resonates with Schopenhauer's view that the world is a representation shaped by the will, and that compassion extends beyond human beings. Transhumanism's optimism about overcoming biological limits can be contrasted with Schopenhauer's caution that any technological augmentation that merely amplifies desire may deepen suffering. By positioning Schopenhauer as a foil to both movements, we encourage viewers to critically assess the assumptions underlying these contemporary trends. Finally, conclude with a series of evocative quotations that anchor the discussion. Schopenhauer's own words, "Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom," serve as a reminder of the oscillating nature of human experience. Complement these with a line from the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh: "The most precious gift we can offer others is our presence," highlighting the shared emphasis on mindful awareness. Add a modern voice, such as the TikTok creator at Suffering Sage, who declares, "When I stop wanting, I start being." These layered citations create a chorus of voices that span centuries, reinforcing the timeless relevance of the ideas. By interlacing scholarly insight, empirical evidence, personal practice, historical depth, and cross-disciplinary dialogue, this segment can evolve from a mere exposition into an immersive exploration. The viewer will not only understand how Schopenhauer's philosophy speaks to climate anxiety, digital addiction, and secular meaning, but also experience, in a small way, the very practices that Schopenhauer suggested for easing suffering. In doing so, we honor the philosopher's legacy, not as a distant pessimist, but as a guide who, through the recognition of the will's tyranny, points us toward moments of quiet, compassion, and creative respite that can sustain us as we navigate the complexities of the modern world.